Happy Thursday, readers. Today for a reading workshop, you're going to need your reading notebook, your green ELA resource folder that's inside of your anchor binder. Remember, don't take it out. Just make sure that you have it opened. Pencil and a glue stick. Remember, Mrs. Ling uses a pen, but that's for you to be able to see in the video. You are using a pencil from home. On the left side for your teach pages for reading, we're going to take out the next two sheets we're using for our reading strategies. One is going to be used for our modeling of the lesson, and one will be used today when you read on Epic. Keep the last page for Friday's lesson inside, close your folder, and tuck that to the side. We're going to then look at our reading notebook, and we're going to turn back to where we finished our lesson yesterday on predictions. Yesterday we read our story of the Garden of Abdul Ghazazi, where we were making predictions before we read, during the reading, and then when we were finished, we were answering the question as, was our predictions correct? And then you were to explain why or why not. We also had our sentence stems that you could use in creating your predictions to show your own thinking, but also adding that text evidence that shows the support or where your thinking came from. In your independent work for your classwork, you read the article called Topiary, A Living Sculpture, and this is how we can use the same reading strategy that we did in fiction, but we can then transfer it to a piece of nonfiction or informational text. So we use the same strategy where you were to make your beginning prediction, make a prediction as you were reading using the questions provided as a guide, and then when you were finished, you once again we're answering that question of, was the prediction you created correct? Why or why not? Today we're going to be moving on to the next side, which is page 28. And since we have a in-class page and a independent page, we're going to also turn to page 29. Once you've numbered the pages, we're going to flip back to the table of contents. And as we said, we're going to continue our work on reading strategies. We started with visualization, creating those pictures. We then moved on to what kind of questions can we ask ourselves as readers based on what the author's providing in a title or the text and questions, or in the illustrations. And then yesterday we moved on to what kind of predictions could we make based on what we know from the words or illustrations as well. So today our next reading strategy is going to be determining importance. And then we're going to put today's date, which is 9-3-20. Once you've written in your table of contents marking the correct page, go ahead and turn back to page 28. Remember, at any time during our lesson, you may pause the video so you can get yourself caught up to stay organized and to have your notebook look just like Mrs. Ling's. So because we have two of the same pages, I'm going to go ahead and just take the top one, use my glue stick, making the frame and then the X through the middle, turning it over. I like to make sure that the top of my page is towards the inside seam, just so I can turn my notebook the way I'd like to. Then I'm going to flip the page to where we've already marked page 29, and once again do the same type of work with our glue stick and the X through the middle. Just make sure you smooth it down so you get all the bubbles out. All right, and then we're going to turn back to the other side. And because this page is turned to the side, we're going to go ahead and already adjust our grid or our 4 boxes. So we have been working on what strategies do we have as readers to be able to better comprehend the text that the author's providing us. So our teaching point today is going to be readers are going to be able to determine or decide which information is going to be the most important by using or analyzing parts of the text and seeing which of those moments are of value and which parts maybe require less of our attention. So we're going to sort through actions of our characters or information as we read, and we're going to organize it so we only have the most important and interesting facts recorded. So this is an anchor chart that is also provided in our lesson, so you can go ahead and click on that so you can see what Mrs. Ling's referring to. So as readers, we're going to decide, well, what is in this book that I need to pay closer attention to. So we think of noodles and how when we start making noodles or pasta, when we make dinner, we have our pot, we have water, and we put in our unbaked or uncooked pasta noodles. So we can say, well, the book has all of these ingredients. They have a cover, they have the words, they have pictures. So that's the entire book. And our brain, we're going to think of it as a strainer. So they're two separate items. But when we are reading and as we finished, we're going to take the most important parts of the book, which in this case we're referring to the noodles, and using our brains to sift through the words and all of the information to only hold on to what's really important. So when we think of it as the comparison of our noodles, well, we don't necessarily need the water, we don't need the pot any longer to make the pasta noodles be ready for us to eat. We sift through and sort to only leave what's most important. So we say the less important details are left behind, and the most important details are then considered to be some of our main ideas that we focus on. Today, we're going to be moving on and reading a story called Zathura. So I'm going to move my notebook just for a moment so you can see the front cover. Zathura is another book that we're using in this author study when we're focusing on our reading strategies by Chris Van Ellsberg. Yesterday, we read one of his stories that focused on the dog, Fritz, and I gave you a little clue that he uses the character Fritz and tucks him in and hides him in all of the books that he writes. So he's usually in one of the illustrations, and he's usually kind of hidden somewhere. So as you're listening today and we are sifting through to find the important information, I want you to also have your eagle eyes out to think of, can I spot Fritz somewhere in the background of our story? Okay. So remember, we're going to be using our brains like a strainer, sifting through all of the information being provided by the author to only hang on to what's most important. As we begin reading, we're going to be using this chart to track some of the important information. So we're going to start by writing the title of our story. So today's story is called Zathura. So we're going to write Zathura. This is also a book that a movie was based off of. And if you haven't seen it, it's a good one that I love to watch with my kids as well. So as we're listening, I want you to focus on these 4 categories. So who are the most important characters? Where is this story taking place? So we think of the setting of when and where. What is going on in the story? What's the problem? We have some sort of dilemma that the characters are faced with that they're trying to find a solution to. And then finally, we're going to track our solution. So as I'm reading, I want you to go ahead and record information as you hear it. After we're done, we're going to analyze what was the most important parts that you wrote down and jotted for your notes. And we're going to just cross out some that might have been just what we call miscellaneous information, but not necessarily important to understand the main focus of the story. So remember, use your note page to track and just jot down some ideas, focusing on the characters, the setting, the problem, and the solution. And then we'll analyze that data when we're done. Zathura, a space adventure. Mom! Danny Budwig yelled, Mom! Walter and Danny's mother stopped at her son's bedroom door. Walter, she said, get off your brother. Honestly, if you don't stop pulling on his nose like that, it'll end up looking like an elephant's trunk. Oh, yeah, said Walter. Then he'll need the ears to match. He let go of Danny's nose and grabbed his ears. Enough, Mrs. Budwig shouted. Danny started it. Look what he did, Walter yelled, picking up his walkie-talkie. The antennae was dangling by a wire. See? He breaks everything. I'm sure he didn't mean to, Mrs. Budwig said. Was an accident, Danny mumbled. From downstairs, Mr. Budwig called to his wife. We're going to be late. Mrs. Budwig gave her sons a kiss goodbye. I set some dinner out in the kitchen. Dad and I shouldn't be too late. Can't you take him with you? Walter whined. After their parents left, Walter sat down in front of the television. Can me and you go out and play catch together? Danny asked. It's you and I, said Walter, not me and you. And the answer is no. Danny really wanted to play. He threw Walter his hat, but Walter just ignored him. Then he tossed him a baseball and beamed him on the head. Walter jumped up. All right, you little fungus. Now you're really going to get it. Danny bolted out of the room, down the hall, and out of the front door with Walter close behind. They ran into the park across the street, but Danny couldn't outrun his brother. Walter tackled him. I'm telling, Danny squealed as Walter got a grip on his nose and pulled. Then he let go. Hey, what's that? He said. Right next to the boys was a long, thin box resting against a tree. Walter got off his brother and picked it up. It's just some demo game. Here, he said, poking Danny in the stomach with the box. It's for babies like you. He trotted off as Danny read the words on the box. Jumanji, a jungle adventure. Danny stuck the game under his arm and ran home after his brother. Remember, at this point in the story, you're jotting down any of the characters that are being mentioned to keep track of, and then when we're done, you can analyze whether or not that they were important to the story. Back inside, Danny looked at the box. It was covered with pictures of jungle animals. He took out dice, some tokens, and a very plain game board. Walter was right. It was a babyish game and probably boring too. Danny started to put it away, but discovered, jammed tightly into the bottom of the box, another board. He banged the box on the floor and out it popped. This board was more interesting. It showed flying saucers, rockets, and planets in outer space, with a path of colored squares leading from Earth to a purple planet called Zathura and back to Earth. Danny put a token on Earth and then rolled the dice. After he moved along the path, something surprising happened. A buzzing sound came from the board, and with a click, a small green card popped out of the edge right in front of him. He picked it up and read, Meteor showers, take evasive action. Hey, Walter, Danny started to say, what is when he was interrupted by a noisy rat-a-tat-tat sound coming from the roof. So as you had stopped previously to write down important characters that you are encountering as I read, think about what else is going to be important. Right now you're jotting down where the story is taking place or when it's taking place, and then some ideas in the problem box. What do you think is wrong right now? Walter looked up from the television. Holy smoke, he said. Must be a hailstorm. It's not hail, shouted Danny, holding up the card. It's meteors. The noise grew louder, like 1,000 golf balls bouncing off the roof. The room got so dark. Walter turned on the lights, and then kaboom! A rock the size of a refrigerator fell through the ceiling and crushed the TV. See, Danny said, I told you, meteors. Walter stared at the hole in the ceiling. Okay, he agreed. Meteors. But how did it get so dark so fast? Through the hole, he could see what was left of his parents' bedroom, and beyond that, a black, star-filled sky. It looks like night up there. It's not night, said Danny. It's outer space. What are you talking about? Geez, outer space? Walter muttered as he went to the front door. We just lost track of time. It's night, that's all. He threw open the door and almost took a step outside before he realized there was no outside there anymore. At least, not the one he expected. So remember, as you are jotting down ideas, thinking of where the story is taking place, if there's been any changes or things that have suddenly happened. See, said Danny, outer space. He led Walter back to the living room and showed him the Zathura game board and the card. Walter sat with his head in his hands, gazing at the path of colored squares that wound around the board and ended back at Earth. Looks like, said Danny, we keep on playing or we're up here forever. Great, said Walter. Up here with you forever? He took a deep breath, put a token on earth, and then rolled the dice and moved along the path. The board started buzzing, and click, a card popped out. He studied it silently and then tossed the card on the board. Danny leaned forward and read, "The polarity of your gravity belt is reversed. I wonder what that means." He looked up, but Walter was gone. "Walter!" he cried out. "Up here," answered Walter. Danny looked up and saw his brother pressed against the ceiling. "I've lost my gravity." "That's not all you're going to lose," Danny said nervously, because he could see that Walter was being pulled slowly toward the hole in the ceiling and a lonely trip into outer space. Walter realized it too and started clawing at the ceiling, but he couldn't keep himself from moving closer and closer to the hole. Danny looked around. Lying next to the meteor was the cord from the shattered television. He tossed it to Walter, who knotted it tightly to his belt. Danny grabbed the end of the cord and tied his brother to the sofa. Remember, readers, as you are listening to the story, you're adding to the characters, where and when the story is taking place, and what are some of the problems our characters are encountering. Danny rolled the dice and moved his token along the path. Click, out popped another card. "Your gyroscope is malfunctioning?" Suddenly the house tilted. Everything in the room slid to one side and Danny got buried under a mountain of furniture. He slowly dug himself out, clutching the game, only to find that Walter was floating back toward the hole in the ceiling. Danny tied him to the sofa again and handed up the dice. Walter rolled and got his gravity back, dropping to the floor with a thud. Danny moved his piece and handed him his card. "Your robot is defective?" Walter read. From the hallway came the sound of rattling metal and a steady clank, clank, clank. The boy stared at the doorway as a shiny silver robot stepped into view. He was having trouble walking on the tilted floor. His head rotated back and forth and seemed to freeze on Walter. The robot's eyes lit up and he spoke in an odd, mechanical voice. "Emergency, emergency, alien life form, must destroy." His claw-like metal hand snapped open and shut. "Uh-oh," Danny whispered. "I think he's talking about you." Fortunately, when the robot stepped forward, he missed the door, banged into the wall, and fell to the floor. He got up and did it again, and then again. "Better hurry up and roll," said Walter, "before he makes it in here." Danny rolled the dice and took his card. "You passed too close to Taurus 3? Gravity greatly increased?" The room began to level out, but something strange was happening to Danny. Walter looked at him. "Holy smoke," he said. Danny was getting shorter and wider, too. Soon he was about the shape and size of a large beach ball. "Walter," he said in a low voice, "I feel very heavy." "Destroy alien life forms," the robot repeated from the hall as he picked himself up again. This time he made it through the door and headed for Walter. Danny yelled to his brother, "Push me." "What?" said Walter. "Push me." Danny yelled again, "Just push me." Walter bent down and gave his brother a shove. Danny rolled across the room and like a giant bowling ball knocked the robot over and flattened his legs. "Did I get him?" asked Danny, who couldn't see because he rolled up against a wall and was upside down. Walter pushed him back to the game board. "You sure did," he said, patting his brother's head. "You were terrific." Walter picked up the dice and rolled. He took his card and his hand trembled as he read, "Zorgon pirate ship launches photon attack?" Through the window, the boy saw a spaceship. 2 points of light shot from the ship and headed directly for the Budwig home. The first one hit the chimney and sent bricks falling into the fireplace. The second hit the upstairs bathroom. Water began dripping down from the hole in the ceiling. Walter handed the dice to Danny, who had a hard time lifting his short, heavy arm. He rolled, and as Walter moved his token for him, he slowly returned to his normal shape. A card popped out. Danny read it silently. "This is bad," he said. "Zorgon pirate boards your vessel?" The room shook as a spaceship banged up against the house. The boys heard footsteps on the roof. Through the opening in the ceiling, they saw someone or something climb through the hole in the roof and enter the room above them. Danny and Walter moved to the hallway, standing behind the flattened robot. They held each other, too terrified to move. A humming sound came from their feet. They looked down and saw the robot's eyes light up. He lifted his head, fixed his eyes on the hole in the ceiling, and spoke, "Alien life form must destroy." His claw-like hands twitched, but he couldn't get up. Remember to be adding to your list of any characters, or if the setting has changed, or if we have more problems that we want to jot down. Danny and Walter helped him to his feet. He staggered forward as the pirate's scaly tail and lizard-like legs swung down from the hole. The robot lifted one of his claws and snapped it sharply around the creature's tail. The Zorgon howled, jerking himself back and forth through the hole with the robot still attached. He thrashed and wailed, banging against the walls overhead. Then, minus one arm, the robot dropped down through the hole. The boys heard the Zorgon scramble across the roof and saw the flash of his rockets as his ship sped away. It seemed hopeless. The robot's eyes were dark again. They'd been playing almost 3 hours, and their tokens rested a galaxy away from Zathura and twice that far from Earth. "We're never going to make it," said Walter. "Sure we are," answered Danny, and he handed the dice to his brother. "Me and you, together, we can do it." Walter cradled the dice in his hand and sighed. "You and I," he said wearily. "You and I." He looked at his little brother, who was grinning. "That's right," said Danny. "Together." Walter rolled the dice, a 1 and a 2. He moved his token to the only black square on the board. The card popped out. "You have entered a black hole," Walter read. "Go back in time 1 hour for each mark on the dice." He jumped up and looked around the room. "You see any black holes?" His brother pointed to the floor. A black spot was slowly spreading under Walter's feet like a perfectly round puddle of ink. At first, Walter thought he was sinking into it, but it was the hole that was rising. He tried to run but could not feel his feet. Then, as the hole rose higher, he couldn't feel his legs either. "What's going on?" he cried. Danny looked below the disc-like hole. "Walter," he said, "the bottom part of you is gone." As the hole rose higher and higher, there were less and less of Walter until only his head remained. Danny tried to pull on the hole to save what was left of his brother, but his hands passed through the blackness as if it were made of smoke. His chin dropped to his chest and he began to sob. "Danny," Walter called softly. Danny looked up at his brother, floating's head. "Danny," he began, "I never told you this, but I—" And that was all he got to say, because the hole kept rising past his mouth, his nose, and finally right over the top of his head. Walter was completely swallowed up, floating in empty darkness. He closed his eyes as he began to spin, plunging head over heels through pitch black space. Then thud! He landed hard on his knees. There was something in his arms, something wiggling around. He opened his eyes and found himself back in the park by his house. He had an arm wrapped tightly around Danny's neck and a hand gripping the boy's nose. "I'm telling," Danny squealed. Walter let go and fell back on the grass. He was dizzy, very dizzy. Danny jumped up and started to run, but stopped. "Hey," he said, "what's that?" He went to a tree and picked up a box resting against the trunk. He held the box out to Walter. "Look," he said, "it's some kind of game." Walter grabbed it. "Hey, give it back," said Danny. His big brother got to his feet. "You don't want to play this," he said. "Trust me, I tried it once." He went over to a trash can and jammed the box deep inside. "Come on," he said. "I've got a better idea. Let's go play catch." Danny smiled. "You mean together? Me and you?" Walter put his arm around his brother. "Yeah, that's right," he said. "Me and you, together." The end. So as we were reading that story, you were asked as a reader to jot down which characters were being introduced by the author, where the setting is and when, and then some possible problems our characters are facing and encountering throughout the story. And then now that we're done, I want you to jot down your ideas about the solution. So thinking about our two main characters of Walter and his brother, we know that those are the two main characters. They also mentioned their mom and their dad, and we had other characters like the Zorgon, and then we had the robot. But our two main characters are the two boys. So making sure that we write down their names correctly. We know that they're Walter and Danny. So make sure that you have Walter and Danny. If you had the mom, so it was Mr. Budwig and Mrs. Budwig, we're going to cross those out because although they were introduced, they're not necessarily the most important characters to what the author is trying to teach us with the story of the two brothers. The setting, we can say at the Budwig house, but we can also say they were at a park, they were in outer space, and you could have been more specific to say maybe they were in their family room or living room, depending on what you call it. But we had to think of when. So they said that this game lasted about 3 hours. So we could have been specific with the time frame or the time of day, which seems to be the afternoon, or even they were thinking it was going into evening because it was dark outside. So sifting through what's most important to the story, well, it doesn't necessarily matter about the room they were in. We know that the majority of the story took place in their house. They started out in the park, and the park is important because that is where the introduction of our problem is. So when they first see the game. So we want to leave that, although that's just an introduction. And then the outer space is where their problem takes them. So they're going out to the planet of Zathura. And then the 3 hours in the afternoon not necessarily is important, but knowing the duration of time that was spent actually completing the game and then going back in time, that's going to be important as well. When we think about our problem our characters are countering, so we can say, well, at the beginning there was something broken, so we can look back in the text to just double check that they were talking about the antenna on his walkie-talkie. So we can then put, maybe we thought originally that it was something about the walkie-talkie being broken. And then we know that they were fighting and mom was saying, don't hurt his nose. So we can say that maybe his nose would stay that way if he kept pulling on it the way it is to look like an elephant trunk. We could also talk about they went to the park and they continued to fight. So we can say they took their fighting outside. Then they played a game, which then took them to outer space. And then when they got back, one of the brothers had completely forgotten about the game. So we need to think of what is the most important information that helped us understand the problem. And the walkie-talkie being broken, that's not necessarily important. That's just a little piece of the puzzle. So we're going to just kind of cross that out because the whole story was not focusing on that item being broken. Our whole story was focusing on this argument, our brothers fighting, and they were fighting because one brother wanted to spend time with the other brother, and the older brother just not really wanting to give that time because he thought he was kind of an annoying little brother. So when we think about the problem, it's the fighting that the brothers are having, which then led them into playing this game, and the game helped kind of focus on the importance of not letting time be a waste. And when we think about it, we have to focus on what's really important. So the fighting is what. So our problem, we said, was focusing on the fighting between the brothers because one of the brothers didn't want to spend time with them. But our solution in the end is that the older brother, he decided he didn't want to waste time. So he didn't want to waste the time he had with his brother, and he ended up wanting to spend time together. So we're going to put wanted to spend time together. So as we're thinking about the problem and the solution, the problem originated with the younger brother wanting to play catch with his older brother, and the older brother saying, no, you're annoying, I don't want to spend time with you. And then in the end, the solution came from the older brother realizing that he might not have that chance. Just like in the game where he was being kind of eaten up by that black hole and disappearing, and before he even had a chance to say what he really thought or how his brother really meant to him, he was gone. So when he came back, he finally decided, well, I don't want to waste any more time. I want to actually play and spend some time with my younger brother. So as readers, we were able to sift through the information using our brains like a sifter or a strainer with noodles to only hang on to the most important information. Today, during your independent work, you're going to do the same type of work with your own level text using a book in Epic. So when you are ready to go to Epic, write down the title of your book in the inside box on page 29. Jot down all of the characters that the author is mentioning. Then as we are finishing up with our story, remember you can cross out the ones that are not necessarily central to the understanding of the problem. Tell me about the setting, when and where the story is taking place. Tell me what's wrong or what's the characters are having an issue with. And then what was the solution that the characters are learning by the end of the story. Because we're focusing on characters, please remember that this is a fiction story. You are not to be reading an informational text or nonfiction text today. Focus on a leveled fiction book.